views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Tonight, our guest is the chair of the City Council's Committee on Buildings and Housing, and so we're going to review this week's decision from the Rent Guidelines Board to raise rents, the recently passed city budget and housing plan, as well as code enforcement, which tonight's guest introduced legislation for. We'll also have an update on the way too long delayed Kingsbridge Armory. So please join me in welcoming back to BronxTalk the council member from the 14th Council District that includes the Bronx neighborhoods of Kingsbridge, Fordham, University Heights, Mount Eden, and Mount Hope. Councilmember Pierina Sanchez, nice to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Gary.
All right, so I'm going to tell you what you already know. The Rent Guidelines Board voted to, this was just this week, voted to increase rents by 3.25% on one-year leases, 5% on two-year leases for rent-stabilized tenants, and that will begin for leases beginning October 1st. It is the largest increase in more than a decade. It affects 16,400 units, and the people who live in those places have monthly median incomes of $858. That's just a little over $200 a week. So I've started the program with something that doesn't make you happy.
Oh, you definitely did. Yeah, I was watching the vote. I testified and I was watching the vote earlier this week, and I cannot tell you, Gary, how angry it made me that at the sort of when we're starting to think that we see the light at the end of the tunnel from this horrible pandemic, and we're trying to focus on recovery and we're trying to focus on those who were the hardest hit, the Rent Guidelines Board goes ahead and just increases rents the highest amount that it has in a decade. It's just unconscionable. And I'm not one to say, oh, landlords, screw landlords, right? And it's all about tenants. It's not about that. It's about the fact that there was no balance, that the consideration and the plight for what tenants are going through was not considered. Rents have gone up 76% since 2014, 76%. While incomes have only gone up 16%. And you know, Gary, more than anyone, because you have your finger on the pulse, that does not include our lowest income people. Our lowest income people have seen stagnant wages. And to see their rents going up like this, it's heartbreaking. What
do you think happened here? And in a moment, we'll look at the Rent Guidelines Board in and of itself, because see what the future might hold. But what actually happened here that turned the tide? Because you and many other council members and tenant advocates were like, hey, this is what makes sense. We've held the line for 2 years through the pandemic. What happened?
Every mayor has the opportunity to appoint the Rent Guidelines Board members. There's supposed to be a balance between 3 landlord interests, right? Owners, 3 who are tenants, tenant representatives, and almost always you have these swing votes, which are called the public members. The public members cannot be owners of rent-stabilized properties, and they cannot be renters. They have to be neutral. And so what you've always seen is that mayor after mayor, depending on sort of where they're more or less leaning, they appoint different public members. So I'm not going to point to any particular public member or any particular appointment, but the public members this year were much more sort of friendly to real estate concerns and landlord interests than the past.
I did the research on it. It's actually 2 tenant. Let's put that up on the screen. It's actually 2 tenant representatives, 2 landlord representatives, and 5 supposedly general public representatives. Let me play devil's advocate then for you, council member. Let's talk about the a small landlord, for example. The larger companies is one thing, but somebody who's genuine about saying, look, the building needs help. I don't have enough money to pay to, replace plumbing or, fix the heat or whatever it is, and I need a little help. What structure would work to help those people out? Because after all, that's also quality of life and our housing stock and everything else. What could work to help them do their thing and still hold the line so that tenants don't get abused?
Absolutely, and thank you for that. I always think about it a third, and a third, but absolutely, that is the breakdown that you just showed. So look, Gary, you almost don't need to play landlord advocate or
Devil's advocate.
You almost don't need to play devil's advocate with me, especially when it comes to small landlords. God willing, I'm knocking on wood. We're buying our first house, and I may soon be a small landlord myself, right? And I know so many who are. So here's the thing. We can and we should walk and chew gum. We need to address the crises that are being faced by New Yorkers, in the housing crisis in particular, in all the different ways it's being faced. So I think rent regulation, for example, rent stabilization is critical. It is important. It stabilizes our rent levels. We would otherwise see who knows what kind of rents. I mean, you can look at other cities and see what kind of rents we would see. And rent stabilization really helps to fight against that, right? But at the same time, we do have increasing costs, and we do have an aging housing stock. New York City is an old city, right? And so our owners, our building owners, a lot of them are living it. They're facing it. But when it comes to the small landlord, they do exist, but they're a very small fraction of the landlords that we're talking about rent stabilization in the city of New York. The typical profile of a rent of an owner is a corporate landlord who has multiple buildings, and to varying degrees they're maintaining their property. Yeah. So then if we focus on these smaller landlords, because the bigger ones have resources, they're not the ones. Nobody ever talks about the poor corporate landlord, right? Those bigger folks, they have resources, and that's one conversation. What I think we need to be doing is we need to be talking about what does a more permanent ERAP program look like? What does it look like to subsidize more of our low-income renters, so that renters are not feeling the brunt, but also landlords are receiving the amount of money that they need to maintain operations and pay their property taxes and water bills and everything else. So we need to walk and chew gum. In the year that we're coming out of the pandemic is not the year to raise rents by 5% for a 2-year increase, and 3.25 for a 1 year. That's the argument this time around. It's not never increase ever, right? This is not the time. People are hurting so bad. And so if we want to help the small landlords, let's focus on them and let's see what we can do for them. Property taxes are within the city's control, and so are a lot of other things.
And this is an area we don't need to get into today, but when hearing you talk about all these different possibilities that affect people's ability to pay rent, there are a great need for employees right now. There are many companies saying we don't have enough employees. The reason is during the pandemic, people learned, you know what, I don't want to work unless I get a decent wage. And so I don't want to use the word trickle down because it's not appropriate in this place, but there is a trickle down effect. And maybe if we boosted, various minimum wages or other businesses that are hiring people paid more, they would be able to afford more, and then we could trickle up, so to speak. We're speaking the same language. I'm sure you're with me on that.
I'm completely with you on that, right? The housing prices, there's two sides of the equation. There's the supply side and there's the demand side. On the supply side, that's the government's responsibility to sort of get rid of red tape, to allow more construction, right? To subsidize the kind of housing that the market is never going to build. The market is never going to build the lowest income housing. It never has and it never will. So it's our job to step in and help there. But then there's the demand side. The demand side is the renters. The demand side is the people, right? And what we're talking about with the housing crisis is a crisis of economic inequality. And so there are, I just put a finer point on it, Gary, that of course there are people who have, gotten out of the labor market, or they're placing higher demands. But that's also really fractured by income levels too, right? The city of New York, for instance, it's mind-boggling, but they have some of the highest openings rates, right? Like jobs that are available, because they are having a hard time competing. We, the city of New York, are having a hard time competing with our private sector counterparts. So HPD, for example, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, they don't have enough project managers to help us build more housing, close on more projects, because the private sector that does the development, they pay more, and they also allow remote work, right? So it's a time for all employers to kind of think about what they're offering, people in the marketplace, and treat people with, respect, right?
And also you'll get better work out of them if you treat them better. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt. The number that showed District 14 of the eviction number, I thought it was like 3,000, and it occurred to me. I know the neighborhoods well: Kingsbridge, Fordham, University Heights, Mount Eden, and Mount Hope. After all this time, is it frustrating for you to represent people and try and explain what their lives are like and what the need is like, so when it comes to these very important dialogues, maybe there would be a greater understanding of how we can move people from point A to point B? I assume you do that all the time.
All the time. I mean, I was, as you know, Gary, right? I was born and raised in the neighborhood. My family lived on 183rd and University when I was born. We moved down a couple blocks, and then we lived over in Kingsbridge. And so for me, no matter where I've gone or what I've done, I've always felt it was important to live at home, right? And to stay grounded, to stay connected, because these are my people, right? These are my neighbors. These are, we're all sort of together in the struggle. But then every time that I go to a new space, whether it's been working at a think tank, or it's been working in the mayor's office, the previous mayor, or it's been working in the White House, as one of the only Latinas, the time that I was there, every single time that I'm one of these spaces, it's just, you just get loud, right? And you have an energy that comes from knowing that you are creating space. So maybe I was the first, but I wasn't the last. Maybe I was one of the first, but we're all creating space, and we're all, sort of arguing our way into making sure that our perspective as low-income people, as hardworking, working class people, that those perspectives are represented at the decision-making table. We have a ways to go.
Let's just stay with housing a little bit. The mayor came out with a housing plan he called a blueprint for housing and homelessness, raising billions of dollars for NYCHA, incentivizing developers to build new affordable housing with more density in varying sizes, preserving affordable housing with greater city investment. That's nice. Providing financial assistance to property owners, et cetera, et cetera. Does not mention neighborhood rezonings, even though this was something that the mayor had been enthusiastic about. What did you think as a whole about the mayor's approach to housing? Do you find a sympathetic mayor? Is it still a difficult sell? Did you like this plan? Where are we at?
So there's a lot of good in there. And actually next Friday, July 1st, I know many people might be starting to leave town, but don't, make sure you join us. Next Friday, we're at the council. We're going to have a hearing on the housing plan. And what I would say in terms of just general reactions at this time is there's a lot of good in there. There's a lot of intentionality to try to lift administrative burdens. For example, we know that there's some 2,500 vacant available units for homeless New Yorkers and other New Yorkers who are in high needs categories, that just because of bureaucracy and you forgot this piece of paper, you forgot that, or you're $2 under the limit, or you're $2 over the limit, they are sitting vacant for long periods of time. So there's this intentionality that I appreciate in the mayor's housing plan that is about, centering people over paperwork, and also, using tools creatively. But what is not in there, Gary, is specifics. And what I mean by specifics is how are we going to measure success as a city? When will we know that we built enough housing, that we did all that we could do? When will we know that we built enough of the right kind of housing that our city needs, so that we can say, okay, we did all that we can do? And so I think there's a lot to dig into in the plan, and that is completely our intent. But if you contrast this housing plan with previous housing plans, and not to say that previous housing plans were perfect by any stretch of the imagination, there aren't some of those details in there that you sort of consider your essential, figures, so that okay, we're on track or we're not. So that's what some of the things that we're going to be pushing on, because for example, we got a lot of wins in the budget, which I know we'll talk about in a bit. But one of the things that I fought for the hardest, we didn't get, and that is a $4 billion commitment, annual commitment, for the preservation and the construction of new affordable housing. And the reason that I fought for that is because we need to build housing for the lowest income. That's what the numbers tell us. That's who that is who has the least access to housing in the city of New York, is our lowest income people. And that's more expensive to do, right? And so all of this is math, all of this is numbers, and we need to have benchmarks so we can know, okay, we're doing okay, or we're not really on track.
I'm going to give you an answer to your rhetorical questions earlier. When we see fewer homeless people on the street, I mean, you go and it doesn't matter what neighborhood it is, there are people who need help. And now we're seeing them everywhere, and certainly the subways and the buses, we see it everywhere. So I'm answering your question. When will we know we've had enough? When we don't see them as much as we see them now. I want to ask you about two things. Number one, this is not your district. They're converting Spofford to housing, the old Spofford jail on Hunts Point. Is that the kind of innovation that we need everywhere, to find empty lots? I mean, we've talked about turning over those properties to communities. Is that like a good direction to go right now?
Absolutely, and I would take you one further. So the New York Housing Conference released a report just a few weeks ago, and they showed where in the city is housing being produced. Not just affordable housing, quote unquote, but just any housing at all. And what you see is that the Bronx is number one. We are sort of king in terms of finding those empty lots, finding the Spofford, finding Villa Verde, finding anything and everywhere that we can to put some buildings on there and build some new apartments. And yet there are other communities in the city of New York that are not contributing, right? That are building very little. And it's not that I'm saying that we need to turn, Jamaica, Queens into 42nd Street. That's not what I'm saying at all. But there is a huge role and creativity to be used in terms of how do we look at a neighborhood that has maybe only single or two family homes, and how do we look at those structures and reimagine what is possible there when it's close to transit and all of that, and it can sort of support the density. And so what you see is that there are neighborhoods in the city that might only have single family or two family homes, that if we just legalized accessory dwelling units, which is a fancy way of saying garages and basements, if we figured out a way to make those habitable and up to code, we could make a huge dent, hundreds of thousands of units of housing in the city of New York, which would help us. Because it's not just, it's not all about affordable housing, although that's what you're mostly going to hear me talk about, because that's what my community needs. But it's just about housing in general. We just have an undersupply.
That gets into the $4 billion annual commitment you were looking for. A last housing question, then we're going to do some other things. Unfortunately, the terrible tragedy at the Twin Parks North opened people's eyes to finally, can we get some code enforcement? Talk about your own work in that, and what it showed. What this 17 people getting killed is just horrible. But what that showed you, and what you turned into action, and what you were able to do.
One of the most powerful reactions and sort of cries that I heard after the terrible fire was from Sheikh Musa Drame, who's a leader here in the Bronx, of course. And he had this powerful speech about this wouldn't have happened if it were not the Bronx.
Oh,
17.
I hate hearing that. Talk to the hand on that. I hate it, but it's true.
And it's painful to you, and it's painful to me, and it's painful to all of us because we know it's true. And so, in sort of, it flipped my whole approach of how, the plans I had for the housing committee and the work in the council, there was a whole cadence, and it just flipped, right? And it flipped to a focus on code enforcement, preservation, the dignity of our housing, right? Because what happened at Twin Parks Northwest was a space heater was left on for several days, must have tipped over, started a fire, and then that fire was not contained because there were no self-closing doors. There were self-closing door violations all over the building. So space heater probably means inadequate heat, right? Space heater for days definitely shows us, and the fact that other tenants in the building then told us that there was inadequate heat shares that. And then the self-closing door violations, just infuriating, because this is a law that has been on the books for years, a law that was strengthened in 2017 by now Congressman Richie Torres. And so the council has taken several steps, several measures already, but we're not stopping there. And I fully intend for the committee to be really driving on code enforcement in this coming year in advance of the next winter. So a few things we have done. One is increased dramatically the penalties for self-closing door violations. We have also...
I have to interrupt that. I know that because my building, actually, they sent a notice around, let us know of any doors. And every time I walk down the stairs, I try the doors and make sure they close all the way.
Yes. Yeah. And we all should do that, and I'm glad to hear that. And see, this is where we get into the whole like good landlord, bad landlord. Good landlords just talk to your tenants and they just tell you, right? They're just like, hey, my door doesn't close, and then you fix it. It's just like a little pin might be missing, but that little pin can save so many lives, right? So we're increasing those violations. We're also changing laws around space heaters so that they automatically shut off after a period of time. And for me, I am increasing fines on, repeated, not the first time, but repeated, if time after time, 2 or 3, 4 times, you have not corrected a heat complaints in your building and they keep happening, we're raising those fines from $250 all the way up to $1,000 instead.
Before we run out of time, let's talk about the Kingsbridge Armory. For years, well before you came into office, this incredible structure, incredible facility, huge facility, right in the middle of of your district, right in the middle of the communities, has been laying essentially dormant. There was, of course, the plan for the ice center. I know you and I had a conversation. I liked the idea. I don't know how many other people did, but it's not going to happen apparently now. There was a walkthrough. You and some of your elected colleagues walked through the Armory. Where are we at? What's next? What do you like? What do you think?
Absolutely. So my biggest sort of goal in the first 6 months, aside from working on affordable housing and housing issues, has been to make sure that I receive a solid commitment from the administration that we're going to be the team to get this through, that this mayoralty, this set of elected officials, this iteration of, activists and community leaders on the ground who have been fighting for years, but together we're going to get something done this time around. So we had a tour with the mayor's office. The deputy mayor was there, the president of EDC, several of my elected colleagues, the Bronx Borough president. And we walked through, and one of the first things that I noticed, and I'd been in there before, but I hadn't been to the sub basement. There are 6 levels beneath the drill hall. What I noticed is that, as you might expect for a structure this old, built in 1917, it is falling apart. And you can look up and you can see gaping holes in the ceiling. You can, there were parts where people, and I'm pregnant, right, Gary? So there were parts where I couldn't go on certain portions of the tour because there was exposed asbestos and lead. And so there's a lot of limitations, even just in accessing the Armory as it is now, because of the terrible conditions. So in this city budget, we secured $5 million $5 million to add on to what EDC is doing just to maintain the property. Because in this round of visioning that we're going to do right now with the community, I want folks to be able to go in. I grew up next to the Armory. I remember walking by as a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old and being like, what is that? And I never got inside until last year, right? And that's true for too many people who've never been inside at all. They just know that the structure is there. So we want to make sure that it's open and accessible, because what's going to happen for the next year is we're going to have about 5 or 6 months of intensive community engagement. We're opening the Armory. We're going to have tours.
Do you have something, a vision right now, and you say what I'd like? I'm going to tell you what I think. 2 things. Number one, that the drill floor needs to be some sort of performance space. I'd love to put a basketball court or an ice rink or whatever, or both. You know, you can have that, as well as a concert hall. Imagine having, you know, the Bronx Championships right there in there. Boy, that would be beyond exciting. And then the one level below is a long concourse. Boy, you could put a market in there, a green market, just like they have at Grand Central Station, with Bronx vendors, have us feed our people. And you like that? Do I get a vote?
I love it. I've heard so many exciting versions of what can be there. I like that idea. I love that idea, you know, and what I'm sort of hearing the most at this juncture is people really want to see not just one use, right? Not just one big national ice center or one big sports complex, but folks that I'm hearing the most from in the community, you know, knocking on the doors and talking to folks, they want to see this and that and the other. So health facilities.
Councilmember, we got to run. As I told you before the show, we probably have 2 hours of material, but it's always a joy to have you. We appreciate your joining us this evening, Councilmember Pierina Sanchez, and we'll get you back as things go on. We'll keep fighting. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gary.
So thank you. Well, listen, we got to thank our producer, Stephen Powell, who did a great job this evening, pitching in and doing a little extra, and also Benaya and Richard and Joe and everybody who's up in the booth. We'll see you next week. It's always busy. Good night.